How do we think about the future of humans on the moon? Are there indigenous methodologies that can provide an alternative to the way space exploration is usually thought of? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with Professor Hilding Neilson on these topics and on the future of humanity on the moon. Hello and welcome to Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, and in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Professor Hilding Neilson. He's assistant professor at Memorial University, Newfoundland, and Labrador University. So I may not be saying right Newfoundland, but we'll find out sort of like what the correct pronunciation with that is going to be. He's an astronomer. He works on the winds from stars, but he's also interdisciplinary scientist, and he's interested in the intersection of science, astronomy, and indigenous knowledge, which we are going to actually talk about today. And as he says, as a Mi'kmaq person, he strives to embrace and integrate indigenous knowledges and methodologies to better understand the physics of stars and the universe and our place in it. So this is where we are going to talk about the moon. So first of all, Professor Nielsen, welcome to Chai on the Moon.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Uh, and I had to look for sort of like time zone when we talked about, and it was an hour and a half further to the east. And I had to look at sort of like so Newfoundland actually really is goes to way to the east of Massachusetts.
Mhm.
So in this series, we've been talking about the future of the moon, which I think in the next couple of years, there's going to be a lot of activity on the moon, and also a lot of sort of like precedences are going to be set, which are going to set for the future of humans, not just on the moon, but of space exploration. So I thought I'll start by something that you wrote about, and it was a talk which you gave, which is Indigenous Knowledge and Kinship as a Model for Our Future in Outer Space. I'm going to actually add a link to this paper as well. And this is more about general about exploration of outer space. And here you talk about the third way. You talk about that the way sort of like the two big sort of like the way exploration models are set in terms of commercialization and also in terms of environmentalism, but you talk about that there is a third way as well. Can you set that up a little of what that is and how you are thinking about it, and what are the two dominant models that you are placing it against?
Sure, and I think this a lot of this is driven by the changes in outer space, thanks to SpaceX and all those Starlink satellites that are brightening the night sky. So it's not just the moon, but it's just even thing from orbital space. And the dominant paradigm we have now is one of exploitation. You could track that back in history, whether it's the colonization of the Americas, British colonization in India, and so on. And we're just doing the same thing now, but we're doing it in space, and we plan to do it on the moon. And that's driven by goals for profit and exploitation. That's one way of living in governance. The other way is more proposed around sustainability and environmentalism. One of the big ways that the astronomy community has been engaging with this is to think about the night sky and space as something look for sustainability. So not too much activity, but enough that you can preserve both some level of dark sky as well as having commercial. The thing that bothers me about that is we've been doing that on Earth for decades now. As you mentioned, I'm from Newfoundland. We're famous for our codfish. Codfish was fished here for centuries. When the first Europeans came, you could dip a bucket in the water and pick up codfish. But we had in the 1990s, it shut down because it wasn't sustainable. And largely, when we define the trouble with defining sustainability is we don't necessarily know whether something's sustainable until it's not. And in that respect, we are trying to balance something we can't really balance. That is exploitation to a certain point, to a limit. And so I think a lot of my motivation for writing this around kinship is to thinking around indigenous ways of governance and relationality, uh, in terms of how we live with nature and thinking about space and the moon as part of that nature and part of that relationship. And primarily in terms of kinship, for many indigenous peoples, and every indigenous community is different. But in North America, many of these communities view animals, plants, water through a lens of treaty and a lens of equality. We're not better or worse than the bear or the salmon or the water, but we all need to be together. And so when we hunt bear, it's done through a relationship. When we take a bear, you give something back. When you hunt moose, you give something back. And that builds up a lot on this premise that was developed by Robin Wall Kimmerer around giving back in her book, The Service Berry, for instance, is more recent. So in that respect, I think the third way is thinking about when we go to the moon to take stuff, what are we giving back? How are we giving to the moon as an equal, or what are we giving to space? And while we might think of space void, that empty void has a being and a right to be like that. And so, what are we giving back when we take the emptiness away from outer space, i.e., with our satellites, with our rockets, with our space junk? And that was the goal for that paper.
So, and you use the example, something that astronomers and you yourself as an astronomer are really concerned about, and you talk about light pollution, which has become sort of like, it's for everybody, and also satellite pollution that comes in there as well. How do you see that? I mean, like the way, I mean, I know that perhaps is a more apt place where sustainability, I mean, what would the third way mean regarding the night sky, for example, the one that is here, and the kind of steps that astronomers are trying to take? Is it too late and we can't do anything about it, or do you think that this can inform the way we think about how to mitigate it now?
Yeah, I don't think it's too late. I mean, right now, Starlink is the dominant company in satellites because they have the most satellites in space, and many of them don't work. But, a significant fraction of them are broken or damaged, particularly now with the growing space weather, which was unforeseen by when they were building these satellites. And so we're seeing that there's a lot of space junk, and they just keep putting them out there because that's the model they have, is to dominate the market. And I think that a third way can, because if we're going to put a satellite in space, we have to ask why. We have to ask who benefits, and that benefit has to also in some way protect space. And so right now, I don't think the dominant exploitation model thinks of space as something that has rights or has a
Mhm.
being or has an environment. It's there. We do what we want, and that's no different than what the colonizing countries did centuries ago up to today. It was about what they could take back home, and that's sort of what we're doing in space, and that's what the plans are for the moon through the Artemis missions and the Artemis Accords. So I think we can do something about what's going on in world space because these satellites won't live forever. We can create a new technologies to help bring some of these satellites back down uh, wholly and without damaging the environment on Earth or in the atmosphere. But we have to start making that change sooner. And whether we bring that in through an economic model or through a kinship model, we have to start thinking about this soon before other companies really begin to catch up, such as Amazon's new internet satellite and other companies, as well as the fact that many nations now are committed to space launches and the space economy.
Yeah, and I should mention that you are also a co-author in a Nature paper that came up about why space exploration must not be left to a few powerful nations, and I think that is where your model of colonialism, sort of like all the colonial exploitation, comes in, because it is also done by a few powerful nations or powerful companies. And so the two examples that you use, British East India Company, for example, and the American colonization of the Americas, I mean, in some sense that works within that frame.
Yeah, and in my mind, there's very little difference right now between SpaceX and what we had in Canada, which was the Hudson Bay Company, what you had, the British East India Company, and all these,
Um,
the Dutch East India companies. These are all profiteering systems from colonialism, and we're just doing it today in space. And the only difference, instead of having a governmental monopoly, is just that the cost of going into space is so high that once you get up there and you can start dominating, it becomes a monopoly by competition because no one can compete. Like there's a reason why it's Starlink and Amazon. Amazon's already one of the most profitable companies in the world, so they have so much profit that they can use to build and try to catch up with Starlink.
So I'm going to go to more specific case of the moon in a second, but there was something that struck me, and I think that's something that for astronomers to learn as well. But you mentioned in your paper, uh, you critiqued some of the approaches of astronomers as well. In particular, the fact that even when they use uh, indigenous sort of like cultural knowledge or cultures in that context, oftentimes it has been done, or sometimes it has been done without bringing the indigenous groups into the conversation. And you actually in fact mentioned, and this is also in the other paper as well, of course there is a controversy regarding telescopes and Mauna Kea. And with the whole caveat, of course, I come from Pakistan, so with the caveat, like, not all Muslims are the same in the same way, not all indigenous groups are the same. Nevertheless, you actually bring up this thing that even when astronomers talk about protecting the night sky, oftentimes they use indigenous, or they co-opt in some ways uh, to use that. How do you see that? I mean, do you see that that is still continuing? This was in the past. Is it still happening? Because International Astronomical Union, I mean, they are, of course, in some ways are speaking on behalf of astronomers. And the same thing comes up for when it comes to astronomy on the moon, or saving the night sky, or satellite pollution. How do you see that is taking place, and is it getting better or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When it came up with the issues in Mauna Kea, particularly the development of the proposed 30-meter telescope, there were many astronomers who were calling the protesters and the protectors bad, very inappropriate names.
Yeah.
They were dismissive of the indigenous peoples and their land rights. And I'm not Native Hawaiian, so it's not for me to say no, but I can listen to the Native Hawaiians and support them. And there were many astronomers who were, we're doing astronomy for the benefit of humanity. So you should benefit from us. You should give us your land so we can benefit from it for you. And that's just appropriation of land and that's just continuing colonization. I would suggest that astronomers are starting to learn more and more. There's some positive changes. For instance, there are a number of proposed telescopes and facilities that are being discussed where they are having people interacting around concepts of responsible siting and indigenous engagement beforehand, so that if you're doing it beforehand, at least people can sort of build uh, build land use ideas together. We see a little bit of this with the Square Kilometre Array in Australia, where the local Indigenous peoples in Western Australia were part of the siting from the beginning. While not a perfect a partnership, that's far more positive than some of the others. But there's still a limit. I mean, one of the challenges I worry about is, is no ever going to be sufficient for astronomers in these situations. So, the Native Hawaiians were saying no, but many of the astronomers were like, well, we'll just do better. We'll do better. We'll do better. And what was not being said is that no was not allowed. It wasn't a question of consent. It was a matter of how much. How much do they have to give to the Native Hawaiians to get them to go away? And I think that's where we're still at. Is we're still struggling in astronomy with this concept of consent from indigenous peoples on their lands, and that's a big thing going forward. Many positive results so far, but there's still a lot to learn, I think.
And you think a similar type of thing is with the narratives regarding light pollution? because this is something that you mentioned, sort of like the protection of the night sky. This is a different type of an issue, but because there it is about that, hey, we have the common ground. But do you see a problem with that narrative as well, or do you think that that is actually a better way of approaching it?
There are challenges. Who's getting to define that narrative
Right.
or that common ground as is one of the rare things. There have been very few Indigenous people involved in these discussions. A lot of times, the Indigenous communities, when say the International Astronomical Union is developing their protocols or developing papers, they will think about Indigenous people in the same way. They'll talk about amateur astronomers, planetarium operators as a minor stakeholder in all of this, as opposed to independent nations or people with sovereignties, and so that's a bit problematic. But I think the biggest issue here is a lot of times what astronomers are doing is they are appropriating the knowledge in a very superficial way because they don't necessarily have the connections to the knowledges that various peoples have to defend themselves. And so one of the challenges with a lot of environmentalism in North America is that it tends to depend on native, indigenous folks and native folks to do the work, the dangerous work, whether it's Mauna Kea with Native Hawaiians, whether it was the Dakota Access Pipeline, whether it's with Sowetan and British Columbia, and so on. If the indigenous peoples are the ones that are in the front lines of the protests, they're the ones that are going to be in the front lines of the violence. And so a lot of times that's a whole other level worse than what's happening in astronomy. But in the same way, a lot of the settler communities and astronomy communities are hiding behind those environmentalists. And and I think in many respects, this is one of the challenges that worries me is that the astronomy community will hide behind indigenous knowledges as ways to be more moral and have a better case. But in doing so, they're also not asking, does this indigenous community want satellite internet? You know, there's a story of First Nations groups in Washington State who bought Starlink simply because it was cheaper. If you're in Canada, there are many northern communities that do not have broadband access because there's no fiber optics. So what are we gonna do there? And so we have to be able to understand that Indigenous folk have to be able to make their own decisions and come to their own ways about what is most important. And sometimes maybe that is having satellite internet. Maybe that is having satellites that are doing ground-based imaging to protect from wildfires and stuff like that. So, you know, in the end, it is not so much of a binary choice that the astronomy community tends to make it out to be.
Yeah. Oh, this is really interesting, and a really important point. And so I will use that actually to jump on the conversation about the moon, because in some sense, as that is going to, for good or for bad, I mean, that is going to set this sort of like, the future of humanity in terms of what are the rules we are using, how it's going to go. And I was curious because in your paper and in your talk, actually, you mentioned the challenges regarding the way in the US, or I think in the US, national parks were designated, and a lot of the land was taken from the indigenous people. And for the moon, I mean, if you think about how can the moon be protected, and again, I'm putting it in quotes because I'm using this, like, that this is how one way of how astronomers think about, well, I mean, astronomy is can from especially from the far side of the moon, you can put in radio telescopes and other instruments, and you need to protect it. Now you came out again, sort of like, or you are critical of the notion of the moon as a designated national park or global park or whatever, however you want to call that. And of course, we're not talking about exploitation of the moon in the sense from SpaceX or others. So this is within the context of sustainability or environmentalism or however you want to frame that. Can you say a little bit more about your critique of sort of like, the moon as a national park? What would be an issue with that?
Sure. So both Canada and the U.S., we have our national park systems, which mean those areas have people removed from them. There's no people living in those parks, and that also means we're disconnecting people from the land. While we're also protecting some of the land for people, we're removing others from it. And I think that's a problem because for many indigenous peoples, being part of the land is an important way to not only protect the land but support it. Whether I was in Australia this past summer, and an elder was talking about on some of these lands that the people returned, and they were able to help remediate and protect the land from pollution that was there, because that's what many indigenous peoples do. It's about supporting the land. So, in that respect, the national parks is just a form of colonialism, and other people deciding what gets done. Now, turning the moon into a global or a satellite park, however you want to phrase it, means also dictating how people get to interact with it. Who will get to step on the moon, who will get to use the moon, who will get resources on the moon. And I think that doesn't change the colonial reality of what you're doing. Exploitation is colonialism, but so is demarking some amount of land to not be used. It's about how we engage the land, how we engage with the moon is what's critical here. And so I think for lunar governance, I would argue that we should be thinking about this kind of kinship model for the moon as well. What we give back to the moon. I don't like that's a very tough question to answer because I don't know what we can give the moon that it doesn't already have. But that's part of it. And the other part is, for many indigenous peoples, the thought process is thinking about sustainability or protection in terms of 7 generations. What will be the result 7 generations down the line? Now, the moon will heal itself eventually, but it takes a lot longer timescales to heal itself than the Earth. So maybe we have to think about, well, what is our 70 generation plan for the moon? Is it a perfect? Could a a national park type system be appropriate? It's not the worst idea, but it still falls under this colonial outpost, and and so that's whatever. That means we can't necessarily go there afterwards, and that's not right either. We should be thinking. I think we should be thinking about governance of the moon and how we use the moon as part of nature, how we can actually support it. So whether that means going to the moon and using water for rocketry and maybe giving water back through some other means, or thinking about how we can think about the lunar nature and supporting it, that's a lot to work on. You know, and I think the problem is when we talk about in the end this kind of national park kind of system, we're basically creating this issue of it's all or nothing, and that's one of the things that worries me when working around the space industry and people who are very engaged in space is if we turn everything to what we're doing now versus doing nothing, we can never have a meaningful conversation, never have meaningful governance, because it turns into just a way of dismissing people as Luddites, as antiquated, as whatever. And I think we need to think about how we do work on the moon in again different ways. Not pure exploitation, but not pure isolation. Something something that reflects our relationships with the moon.
And you do mention it in your paper as well about sort of like that space and the moon. I mean, it's an extension of the land. I mean, in the same way, thinking about it, the connection. So I mean, it may be an unfair question, like because it's and something that is hard to come up with specific solutions to that. But do you see, I mean, there are various models here on Earth. You have the Antarctica, like, so, okay, so Antarctic Treaty, I mean, like, for various geopolitical reasons, it's not a United Nations treaty, but it has sort of like maintained its status that it should not be exploited. But who knows how long it's going to last, but it has so far. You have treaties regarding seafloor mining, like, so people actually, okay, so the prevention, like, or preservation of the seafloor, and so on and so forth. How do you think of any model that can potentially be used to come up with a sort of like, a positive framework for for lunar governance in which we can look around?
Yeah, I mean, all those models have been proposed in different ways to think about space and the moon. Uh, I think the trouble with the deep sea treaties and the Antarctic treaties is we just haven't gotten to the point of where we want to exploit them. I mean, deep sea mining is coming about. People have been thinking about mining in Antarctica at various times, as well as various land claims by nations. So, they may be interesting ways of going forward um, for governance, but in both cases, it depends on do you trust the people leasing the governance. So the one model that comes to mind for me is the idea in New Zealand of, and I forget the name of the river off the top of my head, but
Uh,
the New Zealand courts granted the river human rights. And it was done in such a way that the human rights were guaranteed by a tribunal or a group of Maori New Zealanders as well as settler New Zealanders. So they form a committee. And so even that seems like a very positive way to think about guardianship of the moon. But who do you put on a committee? If we put Elon Musk on the committee,
right.
is that something we really want? Um, and in those respects, coming up with thinking about how we think of treaties for how we operate on the moon is very challenging because again, when we're talking about these treaties or the Antarctic Treaty, they're not actually about the mass themselves; they're about our behaviors. It's what our responsibilities and behaviors. And so when we have these things, that's a big um, challenge because the undersea treaty isn't about protecting the ocean; it's about what we want and what humans want. And so maybe we need to think about our treaties as being not between humans, but between bodies, whether it's humanity and the moon in a treaty or humanity, Mars in a treaty, and so on, in such a way that the treaty outlines our not just our rights, but our responsibilities. Maybe, do we have a responsibility to maintain a moon that is essentially its own way of being for future generations? Do we have a responsibility to not weaponize or militarize the moon? Things like that. So maybe those are ways forward. There's no really great way going forward in my mind. And even though the Moon Treaty, I think, had a lot of positive things to offer for it, it was very clear that a lot of nations weren't very interested in it. And I think the challenge we see now is we're seeing the degradation of the Outer Space Treaty by things like the Artemis Accords. And what that means, even the treaties we had in space for the moon and for the moon are being negated by current and more modern interests, or more contemporary interests, particularly in terms of exploitation. So I don't know what a great treaty would be for supporting governance on the moon and supporting them in a both sustainable and a holistic way. But we should be thinking. I don't know if we should be thinking about the treaties that we had previously as examples. The biggest challenge is what we've done on the Earth is mess it up as a species. And every treaty has always operated into the extent that you can run up, do what you want up to that point of attacking the treaty, and then you sort of test whether you're actually violating the treaty or not. We see this with military actions in around the world. We see this with human rights cases. We see this, fairly often. And so maybe looking at what we've done in the past in different regimes is not necessarily the best way forward or the most positive way forward because we tend to basically repeat the same actions where we have the underwater treaty, but mining is starting to begin. We have Antarctic treaty. There have been threats uh, of claims and actions about it, and so on. So I think in the end, I would have to suggest maybe we need a different thoughts about the treaty, and I would think about the treaty not between humans, but a treaty for with the moon or with space as two independent bodies.
And you use actually a phrase in your paper about sort of like humans as guests in there, and I think that's actually a nice way of putting it too. Like because then it's not like, I mean, yeah, your responsibility then comes in. It's not that humans are conquering the moon or sort of like that narrative. Instead, that us being guests in space, in on the moon or on Mars or something like that.
Yeah, I think gas is a very strong way of doing it. Thinking
Right.
about this, particularly in an English language perspective. For many indigenous nations, the indigenous languages, we have things that are animate and things that are inanimate. And things like the moon are animate, but that doesn't really make sense in English. And so if you think of the moon as having as being someone's home, even if it's just of the moon itself, being a guest comes with responsibilities. Like if I visit you and I just start throwing books all over the place, that's not a very good guest, and you're probably not going to invite me back. So, what would do we want to be a good guest? Do we want to think about how we are supporting the moon in that respect? And so, I think that is a very um, helpful way, maybe, to think about it. It's definitely different than what we're doing now.
Yeah, and so we're getting close to the end, but I have a couple of things, a couple of thoughts regarding these things. One is, I mean, in an idealized version, and again, I grew up sort of like watching Star Trek also, so it was like the future was like that you are in some sense space is rewriting the rules, and from in a positive way, right? Although the original Star Trek was more colonial influence than the Next Generation, but nevertheless, uh, and what you are saying, I mean, in some sense, is that version that, well, the existing treaties, the way, I mean, they have resulted on Earth. I mean, that's not the right model, but maybe space as a different place can actually give us an opportunity to rethink the way we think about humans and the relationship with objects. And that's a really hopeful line of thinking. I mean, do you see? I mean, again, maybe something like this can come out, like come about, and can this be a potential rallying cry, or a framework that people can take, not in the same way as environmentalism, but in a different way about space exploration?
Yeah, I think it's a viable way forward. I mean, yeah, the original series of Star Trek, very colonial, very much Americanism in space. And I think that had a lot of lessons for how not to behave,
Right.
through roles of interference, through walking into somebody's home and saying, "I'm here. If you give me my way, I'll use a gun," which was a very much a James Kirk kind of thing. So I think that was a very bad way to think about space exploration. For its time, it was very progressive, but
No.
unfortunately, I don't think it ages well. Even the next generation has some of those elements. That's kind of a problem. So, but having said that, I think having this different way forward of being a guest, being somehow connected, and not seeing the moon as this dead resource that we get to exploit, seeing the moon as its own body, seeing the relationship that people have, whether it is the moon as a grandfather or a grandmother, or the moon as simply a source of light or a source of time in a calendar. And having all those relationships is very important. That does not mean we don't do any mining on the moon, or maybe we never build an observatory on the moon, but it means we have to do so thoughtfully with what we're giving back to the moon and how we're going to remediate our footprints on the moon when we leave. So I think that has the possibility of being hopeful. I I think it's a very hard thing to do because we are in a time now where space is being hyped up in the same way that a lot of tech stuff is being hyped up, and the hype is really loud and somewhat abrasive. And so I think having this as an option is something that hopefully people will engage with some more and have those conversations, because that's the biggest issue is we really need to have the conversations about what it is we want from space, what it is we want to do in space, and have something other than some tech millionaire or billionaire say we're going to go to Mars and colonize and whatever. We need to move beyond that ancient fantasy.
Um, and so I'm involved in thinking about the moon from the with a group of people about the global south. And there is another issue that comes in, where again it's, I mean, what you are saying, I mean, a lot of it is about the lack of voices. I mean, the voices are with either a few countries or with few powerful nations, and with a global south as well. I mean, even if we think about I mean, it's a tricky thing of who speaks for it, because there could be space agencies, but they are part of Artemis, for example, Accord, or the Chinese lunar research station, and so on and so forth. Uh, but there are varied values on how people think about the moon if we look at the broader population, right? I mean, so one potential thinking around the moon would be like, well, I mean, like, okay, so what do the people of the earth want? Okay, so in some idealized way, how do you see, I mean, do you see a potential for alliances with sort of like, with the global south population, which also doesn't have similar kind of voices, uh, or how do you see these different values that people attach? I mean, I love the idea of guest, or like, I mean, I think that is wonderful, but then for some, it's, so I grew up within the Muslim context, so you are a caretaker of the nature, right? Slightly different phrasing of that, sort of like, your vice regent, sort of like, of God, or other types of things. How do you think these different value systems, different values, can potentially talk to each other for a common goal of taking care of the moon?
Mhm. That's a big question to ask. Not sure I'm the most qualified to answer that one. I think a lot of what we should be thinking about is, yes, bringing people together. I know the closest thing that comes to mind is the COP forums for protecting the environment, and we see how that is dominated by a handful of global north countries for the worst, to bottom out and make a worst case scenario. And but I think we need to have something like that where we are elevating voices from the countries that aren't commonly heard in space. A year ago, I got to visit the UN Space Forum in Bonn, Germany, in which a minister from Bhutan was talking about their first satellites going into space. And that's a big thing, and that's a beautiful thing to be able to, to have that engineering to build your own satellites and be able to do that to support your country. And I think having more of those voices is incredible, going to be incredibly important. And I think we would have to break it down into some kind of a consensus form, where not that we have a democratic vote where it's yes or no, it's how do we come to some sort of consensus. Now, granted, that is deeply challenging and difficult in these times, as we can see from the COP forums. But having the voices from a lot of these global south countries is a tremendous step forward. And I think probably the example that comes to mind is the Bogota Declaration in
Right.
1972, I think, where certain equatorial countries laid claim to geostationary orbits, and they were ignored by the global north because it's space, we get to do what we want, and that was the colonial framework of that. By making it unclaimable, you can just do what you want, and that was a disappointment. Even though those satellites are going to be directly positioned over those countries for 24 hours a day because of the nature of the orbits, that these countries were losing their voice. And I think we should be aware of that coloniality of the global north with respect to global south in that respect as well. And so having these decolonial perspectives, whether it's something from the Bogota direction, whether it's uh, documentaries like Afronauts, which is from the 1960s, where it was about space mission from an African perspective. Uh, I forget the exact country, but post-colonial in Africa, and thinking about how we go forward in these respects. This is where I sort of like to lean into the fictions, not from Star Trek, but fictions from Afrofuturism and Indigenous
Right.
futurisms.
Right.
And I think they offer a lot more hope. And so maybe bringing more of these groups together through either the literature, through talking spaces, through other forums, we can start to build up that perspective. We just have to do it in a time frame where these few nations and monopoly companies aren't dominating and destroying everything, as well as dictating what's happening in space. And in fact, I'm worried that is probably the greatest risk we have is not necessarily that we'll colonize space, but the companies that are up there are going to become law-making groups that are going to dictate human labor and human exploitation in space as well.
Like what's been going on in AI, and then it becomes, well, it's too late. We're there anyways. It's things are happening, and you are dependent on that, and so they take over in that sense.
Yeah, and that's it. They're just going to keep shoving it out there until we accept it, whether or not we want to, and that's the worry.
Yeah. Well, towards the end, I have another really sort of like broad question, and I'm just curious. It's, of course, it's a speculative question, but say for example there was no Artemis, there was no lunar research sort of like outpost from China in plans. How do uh, you talk about in your paper also sort of like this the guest, the metaphor of the guest, and also explore sort of like thinking about exploration as a relationship, right? Kinship relationship, as you are referring to. I'm curious, if we remove these colonial contexts and imagine sort of like alternative future, talking about science fiction in that sense, how would that exploration look like? Meaning to say for example, okay, so what would, in that context, free of colonial historical stuff, what would that future look like as on the moon or on Mars or in the solar system? Just as a sort of like a broad open-ended question.
Yeah, that's a really hard question to answer because there's so many different ways exploration can go, and we tend to think of exploration largely through the colonial lens. British, French,
Yeah.
Spanish, but indigenous folk were explorers. People from Chinese people explored the world. People from around the everybody was an explorer and is an explorer in some way. And I don't think exploration would end if we were to do it in a different way. I don't think a lunar research station is not necessarily colonial. It may, if it benefits humanity, if it has benefits for the moon and our relationship with it, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And it's when we decide that we're going to dig up the rocks and take it and do what we want with it and leave nothing behind, but really nothing behind but junk. That's when we risk being colonial. So I think a lot of what we can do can go ahead. It just has to be in a way that it has to be, I think, thinking about principles about what is the benefit for humanity, what is the benefit for where we're going, what do they get out of it, what are we giving back, and we can do that in some respects. Whether it's either, like I said, a lunar research station, maybe it is a observatory on the moon, maybe it's not. But we know what it's not going to be: a giant strip mine or taking all the water from the moon. It has to be something in balance, something that supports the moon. And one of the things I'm trying to think about is, you know, how would we make, how would we work the moon so the moon could be more of itself? Or how would we support the environment on Mars so it would be more of itself? We see this on the Earth where peoples who can who live on these lands in Australia, North America, where those peoples are supporting nature, where the nature is more of itself in that relationship. I think that's where we should be thinking about in terms of our goal for exploration. Not just what we get out of it, not just what we could buy with it, but what is going to be more, and what is going to be more truth of where we're going to be.
Well, thank you so much. This is, I love it. I mean, I think like I mean, like this kind of framing. I think that actually really clarifies it, and I think this is a great place to stop. And Professor Nielsen, thank you so much for your insight. And
Well,
I
thank
mean,
you
these
very
are
much.
tough for uh, hopefully our direction in space, maybe hopefully we'll keep on working on it. Maybe it may improve. But I love the way you place it, especially at the end, and how to think about the space and exploration. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.